You are listening to My Little Narcissist. I'm your host, Lyra Stone, and this is a podcast that kind of centers around abuse recovery and what goes into it, various methods, and just kind of dives into various topics that sort of center around the recovery. And I sort of just give you my own musings and research and things that I've come across as I've gone through my own journey. This podcast has less to do with the abusers themselves or the quote-unquote narcissists. I kind of believe that while it is important to understand the kind of perpetrator of the abuse and what you've had to survive because of them, I do think that that is only one half of the kind of problem. You know, while understanding it is important, a lot of the onus, unfortunately, in some ways, goes on you and the self-responsibility that you have to take to recover and heal. Because while we were victims of something that was outside of our control, something that was put upon us psychologically, emotionally, physically, sexually, etc., and so forth, now we have a kind of duty to ourselves to transform not so much from victims, but more so into the roles of survivors. And I believe the role of survivor comes in time. I think that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with the term victim. However, I think as you first recover from narcissistic abuse and abuse in general, being a victim is exactly what you are and what you were. But when you reach a kind of elevated point, a point in your journey and your recovery, I think you do kind of get a new status, kind of a new label, so to speak, that I know more people would enjoy to hear, which is that of a survivor. Because what we did do was survive. And while it's important to kind of, I think, really acknowledge, understand, and completely cognize that you were indeed a victim. I know a lot of people who, when they first get out, have a very hard time sussing out the difference between themselves and the abuser. When you are in such a severe trauma bond, Stockholm Syndrome, etc., you can often feel a deep alignment to the person distorting your reality and creating these horrific scenarios. And you can put a lot of blame, shame, and guilt on yourself, especially because anybody who is abusive is going to put that on you as well. You know, any situation, no matter how horrific, is not going to be owned by the person perpetuating it. In fact, they're going to need to justify it so that they can't hold themselves accountable to it. That means laying the blame on you, which is one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why victims of abuse, victims of narcissistic abuse have such a difficult time vocalizing what happened or coming forward about it, or even trying to prosecute the abuser. And that kind of gets me into the topic I want to sort of dive in today, and that is the topic of, I guess we call it revenge. I think that a lot of victims of abuse naturally want revenge. Revenge is an ugly word. Revenge is not ideal, but I think as you start to recover, you know, the anger is going to naturally come out, this understanding of the violations that occurred, the true reality that hits you of how deeply you were used, how deeply you were discarded, how deeply you were victimized by someone who had no empathy or care for your own autonomy, your own sovereignty, your own rights as a person, as a loved one, allegedly. And this can be very, very hard to overcome, this feeling of anguish, of anger. And, you know, I feel like there's a lot of guilt there as well, because when we want to, in some ways, hurt someone else for what they did, you know, cause harm to that person, even if it is a natural response to being harmed yourself, you know, I think it's normal to be like, well, that's not right either. You know, I think we've been conditioned since small children for good reason, for moral reasons, for godly reasons, to not want to hurt people, to want to be kind to people, understanding to people, loving to people, to offer them grace and even forgiveness so that, you know, in some ways we ourselves feel worthy of the same actions. You know, it's a kind of natural sort of way of processing and viewing the world. And, you know, you can do that through a spiritual approach, which is, you know, being empathetic and good does feel good on a spiritual level. But it's also just logical. If you cut in line, throw tantrums, and, ignore the rules, oftentimes there are going to be consequences. You learn at a pretty young age that behavior is unacceptable, that you are not some exception, some genius person, some perfect being that somehow deserves special treatment. Like, we learn this at a pretty young age, but unfortunately for people who are abusive, narcissistic, they didn't, or they ignored it. And they never learned that they aren't the sole center of the universe, or they kind of overruled that kind of early lesson that most of us kind of took. And if you've ever been with an abusive person, you kind of know that at least on the surface, they're not exactly lacking in self-esteem. Many of them are incredibly grandiose, very entitled. They believe that the world ought to revolve around them and that they have no need to abide by rules. They may pretend to abide by rules depending on who you're dealing with. But once you kind of scratch at the surface, you realize very quickly that everything to them is really about what they can gain and whether it's worth dealing with the potential consequence. And, when you are in an abusive relationship, those consequences may have started out as pretty big, but over time, they wore it down until they could get away with really bad things because of the psychological manipulation they had been doing to you to kind of override your reality. When we talk about gaslighting, for example, that's a huge part, a huge step in the abuse journey. And so when women or men come forward and say, hey, I was really badly abused. This person did X, Y, Z to me. And there's a lot of I think, heaviness to that, because how do you even begin to explain why you ended up being subjected to that behavior? It's like other people would be like, well, why on earth didn't you walk? And it's very hard to talk about, well, it started out in this small way and then it grew. And, again, this comes down to processing and doing therapy and finding other persons who are also survivors of abuse to kind of help you piece together how much of the situation you were in and how much of it really in many ways was not your fault. It was not your fault that someone exploited you. It was not your fault that you were used. It was not your fault that hope was weaponized against you, that love was used as a ploy and a game and a tool for their own advancement. And, we as humans, especially when we do love people, that can be hard for us to accept that the other person is just incapable of that kind of reciprocation, this natural back and forth. It makes you feel unworthy. It makes you feel small when it's not returned. And then it makes you question your own value and your own self. And over time, this can cause horrific damage. This is especially bad if, this started when you were a child, if you had a parent doing this to you. When you kind of the very first humans that you interact with, humans that you depend on, that sort of help shape your reality in your formative years, if one of those parents or both of those parents, God help you, kind of treated you like you were small, insignificant, unworthy of the reciprocation of love, that's going to affect you for a long time. But it doesn't mean it's going to be a permanent fixture in your mind or in your soul. It just means that you have to do the work to understand that that's on them. This is their own problems. That's who they are. And it is not at all a reflection on you. What is a reflection on you is what you do about it and the choices you make moving forward. So, to talk about revenge. To be angry, I think that anger is a very wonderful thing that proves to you that you're starting to value yourself again. To be angry is to basically say, hey, that was unacceptable. What was done to me was not okay. So what you're really doing in many respects is reinforcing your own worth and your own sovereignty. And that is completely okay. In fact, that's laudable. So when a person starts to come out of abuse and they start to get angry and they start to say, wow, this person that did this to me, they should see justice. They should be held accountable. Other people should know what this person is. But this is also where you get into a dangerous situation, because when you make something about a vengeful journey, a journey of, oh, I'll get it back to you. What you're doing is still kind of feeding into the narrative of your former life. You're still held captive in some ways by what he said or she said to you. You're still railing against these things. And if it's coming from a place of a wound and of an anger, any outcome to that vengeance is not going to feel good. In fact, it's probably just going to make you feel bad in the long run. Because they already, through the course of your abuse journey with them, had you behaving in ways that were completely outside of the norm, that harmed you psychologically and emotionally. You know, to be in such desperate fight or flight, hypervigilance for so long, anxiety and fear, all of those things is going to put a distortion on your own soul. It's going to cause you to lie. It's going to cause you to manipulate. It's going to cause you to live in a world that isn't in keeping to your higher values, to the kinds of person that you probably wanted to be. You know, most people want to be loving. They want to be happy. They want to be giving. We want to be the best versions of ourselves. And when we're in abuse, that's impossible. If we do operate as the best version of ourselves, we are going to be slaughtered and battered and just completely mowed over day in and day out. Because with an abuser, it's all about power struggle. It's going to always be about him winning over you winning. And there's no compromise. There's no kindness. It's just brutality. And so going back into that mindset of once again being winning and losing, you are still going through a cycle with that person, even if it is just in your own mind. And that's not to say that they shouldn't see justice or they shouldn't see accountability. If you have proof of domestic violence and you have the will and the strength, absolutely take that person to court and, get them prosecuted. But for many of us, we don't have that proof, or we don't have the situation in which we can, see that kind of action happen. What we often do have is a lot of damage. Usually they've isolated us. The smear campaigning is, of course, very, very, very bad and very deliberate on their end because, we usually aren't even aware of what they are doing until it's far too late. And that in and of itself can be its own journey because now you're dealing with the persons outside of the abuse. And what often is I think missed in stories about abuse victims and abusers is the persons around them. I was with my abuser for almost a decade, and in that time, I knew his parents, I knew his friends, I knew a bunch of people, and they knew us, and it was a whole circle. Well, I can't very much expect people to suddenly listen or wake up to what's going on around me, even if I had been able to articulate it, in the midst of it all. Because honestly, there's a reason in some ways that the abuser is what he is. And one of those reasons is that because of the company he keeps. I don't mean to put any of the blame of his behaviors on them, but they're kind of like amplifiers. And they deliberately choose amplifiers, persons who are going to enable. They're not going to challenge. They're going to kind of ride in the wake of their own creation of chaos or entitlement. And they're also not going to present what they're doing to those persons versus what they're doing to you. They're very calculated. And what can be very hard leaving abuse is understanding how calculated it was. So many of us kept saying, well, what they're doing must be unconscious. They must not be fully aware of themselves. They must be, and in some ways you're right, but in many ways you're wrong. And in many ways it's really irrelevant. They do know what they're doing. And if you don't believe me, all you need is one example in your own life. My abuser could literally be throttling me. And then if he saw somebody just a few steps away, turning a corner, he would instantly smile and just act like a completely different person. He can switch. And they always have control. It doesn't matter how inebriated they are, allegedly, or how emotional they are. It's actually very telling how much they can switch it off. Because in the end, what you represent to them is very different from what they represent to them. And they cannot change in many ways the way they view you. They don't even really possibly understand how they view you as inappropriate or distorted, because to them, everything outside of themselves is themselves. So we're just pawns and pieces kind of for their own master plan. None of us has sovereignty. So they're going to deliberately choose persons who are really naive or incapable of seeing that side of them. And it can be really frustrating because sometimes the evidence can be insurmountable. You can like really just, here's a PowerPoint presentation with graphs and charts and photos and videos and everything else that you can possibly, and they may sit down and drink their coffee and look at it. But in the end, many of them, it is a choice to kind of bury their head in the sand, because if it's their boss, well, it's hard to get a different new job. Maybe they like their job. So what good does it serve them to look at the reality and truth of their boss if it makes them have an even harder time in their own life? Well, maybe it's their son. Who wants to see their son as a monster? Like most mothers are going to instantly think, oh, that must be my fault. What did I do in their upbringing? Well, that's uncomfortable. Who wants to do that? We are all in so many ways tied into our own distortions and our own lies that we tell ourselves that abusers can use to continue to preserve and protect kind of their own narrative and their own behaviors. And so when I say revenge, what I'm really trying to get at is revenge against what, really? Because if you go into any situation, half cocked and screaming, with your guns blazing metaphorically and everything, you don't really know what's waiting for you beyond that door. And the ruthlessness that one has probably already seen and undertaken and been a part of and been victimized by, we know how relentless it is, how it lacks a conscience. And to confront that is to very much be putting yourself in the field of immense danger and a lot of additional toxicity. And again, I'm not saying no to the venture. I'm not saying no to the attempt or the desire. Don't get me wrong. I'm merely saying you have to be honest with yourself about what it is that you're really confronting and what it is that you're really aiming for. And oftentimes when I see a person struggling, I typically will just say, give it time. Give it time. Because the clearer picture you have in your own mind, the clearer understanding you have of what happened, the more power you're going to have back. And honestly, if you go into that still defensive, still raw, still wounded, they're going to know exactly where to poke and where to attack and where to go for. And it's going to be a pretty easy battle for them because we're still not completely convinced of our own rights. But the longer you are out and the longer you sit with yourself, and the more confidence and empowerment you gain through kind of the realization that you are special, you are great, you are loving, you are so many of the things that your abuser said you weren't or your abuser took from you. And over time, those things can really make you feel a sense of inner peace and happiness that will just take your breath away if you just sit with it long enough, if you just don't give up, if you don't give in to despair. And while a narcissistic abuser can often look like the victor in every respect, they'll often go riding off, by the end of the day after they've brutalized you and say you called it quits and you limped out of the arena, they're already finding someone else. But they already had that person in the wings. Don't kid yourself. And they seem to already be fine and moved on and happy and they're going to music venues and they're eating great food with tons of friends and laughing and just having a thrilling, wonderful time. And it seems so unfair as you sit there kind of in the dark, bruised and battered and alone and abandoned. But what you really have to understand is that's an illusion. You've always known that's an illusion because you've lived in that illusion. The illusion of what they needed you to help them create. Every time they came home and needed that ego stroked, every time they demanded all the attention and focus and energy to be directed at them, with nothing, of course, for you. You literally starving, them literally being fed nonstop. And the reason for that. They have to be. And they're in constant desperation mode. They're constantly afraid. And they're constantly putting up a facade. It's all just smoke and mirrors. And the sooner you stop comparing, the better. Because comparing is irrelevant. They are gone. And if they look happy, so what? It's completely not unessential, inconsequential, unimportant. What is important is you're free now. And freedom is something that can take a while to adjust to. When you've been enslaved, so to speak, mentally and sexually and physically and emotionally for so long, freedom can be a very scary thing, to suddenly be only accountable in many ways to yourself, to no longer have this other voice that's demanding to be fed. Now you have to feed yourself? How do you even begin to do that? And it can take a while to kind of learn how to direct love at you and affirm you. But once you kind of recreate the conditioning in your own mind, that voice that says, instead of saying I am worthless, I'm small, say I am worthy, I am great. Just starting there and kind of sitting with the uncomfortableness, because I know that they were very much like, you aren't allowed to talk like that. You aren't, any time that you asserted yourself and say, I'm worthy, they said, no, you're not. You need to sit down. And now you don't have that voice. Now you can say, I am not only worthy, I am blessed. I recently wrote a memoir, and in it, I kind of reflected on a phrase I would say to myself when I was younger. And I said, I can subsist off of very little love. And I considered that to be a virtue and a strength. I can subsist off of so little love. I considered myself resilient. Oh, that's okay. I can give all of this. I just need a little crumb and I am good to go. But you don't need to deprive yourself of of infinite resource, a resource that's around you and everything and everyone. Love is not something that should be squandered. It's not something that should be hoarded, and it's certainly not something you should deprive yourself of. Love is in everything and everyone, and all you have to do is reach for it, and all you have to do is put it inside yourself. It's whether you feel worthy or not. Look at your monster abuser. She felt completely worthy of it, even though there was zero reason for them to feel that way. So, but you know what? They still felt it, and they still called out for it, and they still, in many ways, got it, even if they didn't have any ability to generate it themselves. You are not them. You can generate your own love. How amazing is that? They have to go out to other people who can generate and keep poaching from their fields. But you are your own field, and you can plant and grow whatever you need to within it. And they don't get to come in like locusts and just strip down every granule of grain that you've stored there. That is yours now to do whatever you want to do with it. And once you look out on the field of your own bounty, your own love that you can generate, gosh, you can feel infinite then. You can feel the most empowered you've ever felt in your life. And once you have that empowerment, then comes the, I think, solidness, the feeling of I can face it that comes into play. And when that happens, when you're no longer kind of operating from this defensive, sort of half afraid, scared mindset, you can get your quote-unquote vengeance, although I would prefer to call it vindication. Vindication is very different from vengeance, and vindication can come, if you want it to, in its own time, after you've basically stopped responding to the things you shouldn't be responding to. Like the opinions of the persons around him, the persons who he feeds off, his supplies. You have to be able to put their perspectives aside. What they feel and think about all this, irrelevant. Because you know the truth and you understand what it was, and you understand with complete authority how it was. And once you are sure and confident and solid, you'll suddenly find that speaking on it, if you choose to, which you may not even need to or want to, it's so much easier, and it's so much more believable, because you are just simply operating from truth, not from the distortions and kind of jaded realities that he or she kind of strapped onto you and used to sort of poach from your field of love. Do you like my metaphors here? So anyway, I think if you are truly seeking out vindication to hold this person accountable, just understand that time is going to do more to help you than action necessarily will. Because the longer you wait to really heal and figure out what even went on, the better it's going to be for you when, if I should say, you do choose to share your experience. And I think what you will also find as you move forward, sharing your experience will become less imperative for you when it comes to persons who have been targeted by this abuser, persons who the abuser has deliberately kind of pulled into his fold or her fold. Because I think everybody is on their journey, and no one deserves to be leeched off of by an abusive person. Nobody. But there's reasons that persons are targeted. There's a reason you were targeted to be their kind of primary person, and there was a reason they were targeted to kind of be his enablers. And a lot of times it's because it could be multiple reasons. I know for some people it's because they're in a social scene. And in this social scene, they really like the the ability to go out and have fun with this person and maybe some persons this person's with, and their toxicity, their behaviors are less important to that person in lieu of having a feeling of being in a clique or belonging in a group. And that's really hard to dislodge. If you wanted to go to that person who say this person is even active, like lots of them are, in social justice like organizations, and you go to them and say, you know how you're involved in this social justice outreach? Well, this person that you have drinks with on Sunday, that you go to the barbecue on da 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 da, this person is actually a rapist, or this person is actually a violent offender. This person actually does these things. This person dislocated this woman's shoulder and did, there's all sorts of horror stories. And that's going to, of course, that puts an onus of responsibility once they know this truth on them. But you are definitely making a gamble when you do that, because you are disrupting someone else's life and someone else's reality. And while the betrayal that you feel probably by them sort of ignoring your own pain, ignoring all the signs that were there, or even taking the abuser's side and saying, I guess she really was crazy. I guess she's the one that's to blame. Wow, I believe him. Even though all the statistics or all the evidence points to someone else or something else, I'm just going to side with that person. It really comes down to, are they worth it? Is their perspective worth it? This person who doesn't even have the backbone to challenge their own social group, who feels so little identity or strength within herself or himself that they cannot even dare to rethink what their social group means as far as a reflection of them. And everybody has their journey. And what's great about surviving abuse and recovering from it is you kind of do learn that just how important relationships are, how important it is to cultivate well-meaning and good, solid connections to individuals who are not just about things that are easy to be manipulated or taken advantage of. And there could also be issues with those enablers that maybe you want to speak to in regards to if they're like a family member or something. You're going to understand the dynamics a lot better. And I feel like once you're solid in who you are, in some ways, you no longer need their validation. You don't really need their approval or their belief, because what are you really attempting here but to basically have someone recite back to you the evidence that you already know. Have someone say, that man is this. You already know that man is that. And them saying yes to that or no to that, it doesn't change any of the reality. But if you want to say protect other women or other persons from it or any of those things, I completely understand the logic. Just know that any movement you make towards that goal needs to be well thought out and self-examined. Because I do believe that what keeps abusers flourishing and continuing to thrive in our society is that they're not held accountable. It is that they're able to get away with things to the level that they are. And I do think that we standing up and calling it out and using words of authority to do it is essential for that kind of transformation and reform that I'd like to see in society. It cannot be done without a lot of carry through on your end. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to equate it, but I think it is a good example. When you think about the civil rights movement, back in the 60s or whatever, with Martin Luther King Jr. and all those things, when black persons were fighting for equal rights, to end segregation and things of that nature that was happening in their communities, and they were saying enough is enough, they had to be extremely calculated in how they approach things because of the danger in the world, since they were minorities, since they did not have authority and power, because the abusers, these white persons, and they were the ones that could throw them in jail cells and murder them, without much consequence to their actions. So they staged sit-downs, and they made sure to be very careful with their words and their deeds. And these sit-downs, these, peaceful protests, the things that they did, did lead to a revolution and change. We are seeing now a new revolution and a new change going on. There was progress. There was a lot of it, and now most of us celebrate, Martin Luther King Jr., most of us celebrate the civil rights movement, what it means, and many of us carry that torch and try to move forward and better, the race relations in our country, and we continue to see the empowerment and vindication of black persons, as they go through their struggle to attain equality with white persons in America, in lieu of what's been, since the foundation of our country, with slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, and everything else, that has gone on, persevering and rising above it. And it's kind of like, I don't really want to equate the struggle of an abuse survivor but obviously there's a lot of parallels. This is a group that has been abused by systems of power. And abuse survivors, likewise, have been abused, often by persons in power, We can go into gender politics or things. I don't think it's necessary. But, you have to always understand that as much as we want to see justice, as much as we want to see, your word believed as readily as, say, your abusers, we still have to deal with the very harsh realities of what it simply is. And we can let that defeat us. We can let that make us feel bitter. We can just roll over, accept it, maybe go back to another abuser. Sure, there's always that option. Or we could get really angry and defiant and just lash out and, get basically depicted as the thing that our abusers call us. And that doesn't work out either. But there is, I think, a third option. And the third option is when you are able to stay centered in yourself, stay centered in your truth and your authority and your rights as a human being, as an intelligent, personable, sovereign human who has as much of a right as anyone else in this country. We are all equal under God. And you deliver that message with your own voice and your own maturity. And you do not crack. And you do not back down. But you stay calm. You stay rational. And you're able to stay centered, regardless of what the response may be, because you understand that it's not about the exterior. This is about the interior and what you need to do to fix what's damaged inside of you. Anybody who's left abuse is going to struggle with codependency. It's just it's a byproduct of abuse, especially if you were with a covert narcissist, which is what my kind of variety was. They demand that you have an unhealthy attachment to them, where your value becomes tied into theirs. And if they aren't happy, you aren't happy. And if, they're happy, you're happy, but it cannot be back and forth. It cannot be both. If you're happy, that doesn't matter. Irrelevant. They'll probably tear it down because you have to mirror and reflect them. Kind of like when they first met you and they mirrored you. And then slowly they invert that mirror and you need to reflect them at all times. It's awful. But anyway, all that exteriorness really starts to define you, because that's how they define themselves. They define themselves solely by exterior. Remember, they can't generate love. Much like a codependent stops being able to do it. They can only generate love for the narcissist. It becomes this weird cycle of where they used to be able to generate love and give it to themselves, maybe give it to others, maybe give it to their pets. And then the narcissist keeps siphoning off, kind of closing up those dams and kind of all directing that stream to them. And so now you don't even know how to generate love except for this one thing. So it takes a while to stop thinking in an exterior mindset of, I can only love myself if they say I should be loved. No. Love yourself because you're worthy. You're completely worthy. Stand up and fight back, even when all of society or many people in society are saying, no, you don't deserve this. Who are you? And they spit in your face. Or, to go back to the civil rights movie, they hose you down with, a fire, or what is it called? Like the hoses. And they would blast the people in the streets with water. They would chase dogs after them. They would put tear gas in the streets. The horrible things that they did to people during the civil rights movement, when all they were doing was standing up and saying, no, I am worthy. I do deserve these rights. I do deserve to be safe in my home, to pursue an education, to pursue a job, to provide for my family, to not be afraid, to become president, and all these things. And, it's such a testament to the resiliency and strength of an individual to make that movement and to charge and become that voice, And I'm not saying that, we're all going to become Martin Luther King Jr.'s. There can only be one amazing man who could do that. But I think that emulating someone like that, emulating a person who was able to transcend all the voices telling him to shut up and use his own empowerment to help other persons around him, isn't that what we all should do? And I think that this man was also known for his love. He was also known for speaking about forgiveness, but he was also, that's the stuff that's kind of in the mainstream. He was also a very strong-willed advocate for change, and some of that stuff was very grr, you're not going to like what I'm going to say because it's not always peace and love. I guess my whole point is that he didn't need to fight fire with fire. In fact, he advocated against that. And he still saw amazing results. He also died young, but okay, we're just going to end that metaphor and that comparison there because That was very tragic. But the point is that I think when we think about our anger and our need for vengeance, I think it's important to recognize what's really motivating us there, what's really happening inside of us there, and carry through the internal work to come out the other side of it and recognize what is serving you and your higher purpose and your path towards healing, and what is simply going to continue to recycle the same trauma that you were going through. Is this going to be another battle of winning and losing? Or is this going to finally change and you're going to be able to walk in with the kind of resounding kindness and love and solidness inside of you that you wanted, or maybe that you even possessed when you first got into the relationship, that you've now reclaimed and you've reinforced? And once you kind of hit that solidness, once you hit that foundational place of inner peace and resiliency, your need for vengeance, I've often found it fades. Vindication may still be there. But vengeance is kind of a temporary emotion. An understandable but temporary emotion. Operating in the moment and the emotional and the visceral. And if you want to walk down that path of reforming and changing and holding someone accountable, do it. Just do it with these things in mind. Or at least that's my 2 cents. You've been listening to My Little Narcissist. I'm your host, Lyra Stone. I hope you have a wonderful day.